Good morning. Welcome to the Tom and John Show. You are guinea pigs for those of you that are watching because this is our maiden voyage into Cyberland with a new kind of format, which we'll explain a little bit later. And right now I'll introduce myself, and my name is Tom Watschke, Emeritus Professor of Turfgrass Science from Penn State University, semi-retired and still active doing this, that, and the other thing. John is a former student of mine. Now, that doesn't mean anything anymore, except that not everybody knows he was a double major. He was a double major and right when we get going, go to graduate school, and we're able to hook him up down with Peter Noden at Maryland, and the rest is history. He's now at Penn State and recently had gone through some iterations of a job change and decided to stay at Penn State, which everybody's quite ecstatic about. So it's all you, John.
All right. Yeah, as you mentioned, I was kind of putting this out there to social media, and I haven't promoted the show very much, but you know, kind of the idea, which I think you'll explain in a little bit. I've been kind of selling it as advisee, advisor, and that mentorship, and you get kind of you know, the history of kind of what you've seen over the years, and then kind of the me as a new person going through it too. So I'm John Kaminsky. I am an associate professor at Penn State. As Tom said, I had a difficult decision in the last few weeks, and probably the most difficult decision in my life. But I'm happy to say that I'm staying at Penn State and probably retiring there, but not for a long time. So my background is turf pathology, but working with Peter Noden at the University of Maryland, and then all of the places I've been so far, I kind of have a background in agronomy and turfgrass management with a focus on putting green management and a lot of work on annual bluegrass. And so I think that's what we'll touch a little bit on today, but I'll turn it back over to you, Tom.
Okay, John, thanks. A little bit about the format of the program. John and I have gone back and forth discussing what might be a good track to follow. We were in total agreement about having guests, and on our next episode of this program will have a guest, and we'll mention more about that later in the show. And the other is that we want to be able to interact with those watching, be receptive to your comments, suggestions, so please don't be reluctant. That's going to help us guide our way as we go through this program. And as John mentioned, I think we can draw from my experience and John's enthusiasm to help people make some decisions that are getting tougher and tougher to make on golf courses. So that's kind of where we're going. Be patient with us. We have to feel our way a little bit. It's the old adage, you got to walk before you run. And we're crawling at the moment after some technological education for myself earlier in the morning. But without further ado about the format and so forth, I think it'd be prudent, even though it may seem like we're beating a dead horse, to talk a little bit about this past winter and where the status of turf is these days as a result. And I have to preface that by saying that I've been around this business for over 40 years, and I've not seen the extent of winter injury that I've seen, and in fact some places still see, as what occurred this past winter. And part of it is because we're caught in a combination of environmental events, not so much the harshness of winter that caused the problem, but the fluctuation between late winter and early spring that occurred with a few little warm days that faked everybody out, but it knocked the snow away, and it allowed Poa annua in particular to rehydrate. And once that occurs and Poa starts taking up water, all bets are off because it is not hardened anymore at all. The hardening process is dehydration. The opposite is hydration. And once that plant starts to take up water, if it's exposed to the elements in some serious cold weather, and in this case wind, we ended up with some crown hydration, freezing that caused losses. We ended up with desiccation that caused losses. And sometimes these two phenomena occurred within several feet of each other, which is really weird. You don't almost, well, I've never seen it. So, John, you might share what you were seeing.
Yeah, what I wanted maybe you to talk about actually is kind of, what are the ways that turf can die in the winter? Because we've seen, you said, you saw some desiccation and some crown hydration next to each other. Obviously, there were some areas of the country that had, and even into Canada, that had excessively long ice cover. I was just in Detroit yesterday visiting some golf courses, and they had about 3 months of ice and snow cover that followed like a rainstorm that they had in the end of December, and the ice never went away. And so it'd be good if you could just kind of touch on, you mentioned crown hydration, which obviously we know about, but maybe you could touch on all the ways turf dies from the winter.
Yeah, there's John just mentioned crown hydration, which is pretty much on the tip of everybody's tongue when late winter and early spring starts, and we know that dehydrated plants are beginning to take up water, and they're very susceptible to big swings in temperature, particularly when it gets cold. And desiccation, another phenomenon, is not particularly common in the East Coast or the Mid-Atlantic. Much more common in the Midwest, upper Midwest in particular, where oftentimes real cold, windy conditions occur and there's no snow on the ground. Not so much this past winter, but in previous winters. And when that wind blows and the ground is frozen, there's no water available, and if plants have begun to transpire and want to take up water or need to take up water to survive and can't get at it because it's bound in a frozen condition, and then the plants will desiccate. And in this past year in the east, in certain locations, that's what happened. The snow blew off, but not everywhere. And so exposed areas where the snow cover went away when it was really cold, desiccation occurred. And another winter phenomenon is direct low temperature kill. Now, direct low temperature kill and desiccation are very difficult to determine, and I can't sit here and say that, some of what I was referring to or seeing and looking like the desiccation that I grew up with in the upper Midwest was what I was looking at, but without certain micro analysis, you don't know whether there was some direct low temperature kill involved as well. And of course, lastly, another reason that plants disappear in the winter is to fungi, both pink and gray snow mold. We have a lot of snow mold in some years in the east, and other years, particularly in the years when somebody's testing fungicides, it doesn't happen. So that's the bane of the pathologist who would like to have disease and it doesn't show up. So
I think regardless of what happened in terms of death, though, right? So we've got direct low temperature kill, maybe prolonged periods of ice cover. POA can typically we refer to that kind of 60-day mark for POA under the ice. Crown hydration, desiccation. Regardless of what it was, I just say lump it all into winter kill because it's easier to do that. And then so what have you seen in terms of people trying to recover? Actually, let me take a step back. Before that, what can we do to prevent this? Is there anything that can be done? I know there's measures that we can do, and we've seen some top dressing. Obviously, drainage is a big one for crown hydration if you've got a lot of water melt in the spring. What have you seen success with people preparing to prevent this from happening in the first place?
Well, I think longer term, if there's a little silver lining in this ugly cloud of winter, it's the fact that the areas where there's pocketing and poor drainage and swales and the like were very well defined this past winter because that's where the damage was worse. And so longer term measures that can be taken that will allow for that drainage to improve, whether it be multiple applications of materials that facilitate drainage, even as severe as taking sod up and recontouring to get rid of some pocketing. Those are measures that are pretty valuable as time goes along. Of course, in the upper East Coast and Canada in particular, and Canada, I mean Quebec, that province, there's a lot of damage to POA due to numerous factors that we've already talked about. And in those locations, they have really looked hard at covers. There's been research done over and over again in various locations to test the capacity of covers to do the right thing and help along with some of this winter injury. And winter injury, by that I mean across the spectrum of the different types. And the unfortunate part about it is it's like diseases. When you want them to occur, they do, and when you use covers and try to test them, there's no injury where you didn't use a cover. Also, when you look at covers, one year one of them works better than another one, and the next year it's the opposite. So it's a mixed bag of results that have occurred in the research that's been done with covers, and they're downright tricky in terms of when do you remove them, do you put them back down, and so on and so forth. Do you cut? Do you apply fungicides under them, etc.? So it's a difficult process to try to sort out. Now, you mentioned top dressing, and over the years, I guess if there was a consistent method to help with winter injury, top dressing is probably right up there at the top. And that means a relatively heavy top dressing on or before winter onset, and protect those crowns is really what the top dressing is doing. You basically make them unputtable, and then you don't have to worry about winter play except on temporaries, because you just say, no, we can't do it. We're protecting our greens against winter losses, and that's why they're so heavily top dressed. And then the winter precip will take care of working that top dressing into the canopy, and by the time spring rolls around, if you knock on wood and everything's timed great, why, you're good to go.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, what I saw kind of in the northeast PA area and what I heard about in New England and what I saw yesterday in the southeast Detroit area, there were a few things that were common. I think you hit it the nail on the head when you talked about kind of the low areas, the pocketed areas where you it's pretty obvious where you see the damage. I think what I see a lot in some of these cases is you start forming these little bit of lips along the collars where you either get a buildup of sand or the height is just enough to prevent the water from going off. So some people were cutting channels in the greens to try and remove any water. So you basically like sod cut out a strip and let that channel go. In the past, you know, some people had softened those collars. I think surface drainage is a key one, and sometimes we forget about that. Once the ground's frozen, you're probably not going to have much internal drainage going on. And so the surface drainage, if you have bowls at all, are going to, you know, that's where the water's going to set and pocket. And so a big problem. I think the hard thing with the decision-making process, at least for, say, the people that dealt with those rains in December that froze, because you're talking about December, January, and you have no idea how long that snow or ice is going to last.
That's
and
right.
So, you know, are you 2 weeks in when you've got a half an inch to an inch? Do you remove that in anticipation that you're going to get more, or do you go, well, it's only a half an inch, it's not that big a deal? That decision is like, you might as well flip a coin. There's no way that you can predict what it's going to be like. And so for some people, they remove the snow or the ice, and it actually helped them quite a bit. And for others, they left it, and then it continued to build up to 3 to 5 inches worth of ice. And once you get that ice on there, you can't get it off. So in some cases, they try to aerify to remove it, but it just becomes a nightmare. And so I think the hardest thing is, you know, superintendents and golf course superintendents go through that very difficult decision-making process of what do I do? Should I do it? Shouldn't I do it? And again, like I said, it's a coin flip. It's like, you know, yeah, maybe if you can predict what's going to happen, you can determine what you need to do, but that's pretty damn impossible.
Yeah, there's really no crystal ball that's going to help you very much. At Michigan State, back in the day when Jim Beard was there as a professor, he did a lot of research with ice cover and the like, and he did it in freezing chambers, so he could control a lot of what was going on and then measure the number of days that plants were covered. And I think that research was pretty much borne out this past winter, whereas Poa annua is the most susceptible to these kinds of damages, followed by ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, and then lastly by creeping bent. To the extent that creeping bent grasses are quite unique in their ability to tolerate being covered by ice, and for that matter, tolerate being submerged in water. Creeping bentgrass is a bit of an anomaly when it comes to grasses. Creeping bentgrass, as long as it's got leaves sticking up out of the water, can actually move elemental oxygen through the leaves to the rest of the plant and keep it from basically suffocating or drowning because of the lack of oxygen. And to my knowledge, there aren't any other cool season grasses that are able to do that. In fact, that's one of the things that the Dutch knew years ago when they were trying to stabilize the sand on the seaward side of the dikes. They would plant Agrostis species, because when the tide came in, it would be submerged and it would survive. So it's unique in that ability. Problem with the ice is that, as John points out, it's a coin flip. What are you going to do? I think what that really means is you step back and you say, what do we do preventatively? Let's minimize our surface drainage issues, because, as he points out, when the ground's frozen, it's all surface movement of water. And you know, Joe Deutsch, rest his soul, told me one time that Bert Musser, his mentor, who wrote the first textbook on turfgrass management, was fairly long-winded when he gave talks. Let me put it that way. Yeah. He was encouraged at a turf conference at Penn State, which is always held down at the State College Hotel, to kind of keep it a little more brief, would you, Bert, by the moderator. So Bert got up and said, I've been asked to speak about successful golf course management, and I'll do that in 3 words. Drainage, drainage, drainage. And he sat down. And everybody was looking at each other like, what is this? So the moderator, he was totally embarrassed. He said, no, Bert, that was a little brief. You want to explain? Well, that left the bag open, so Bert went on for an hour talking about surface drainage, subsurface drainage, and air drainage. And so what are we talking about today? We're talking about drainage. And the difference between if you don't have any subsurface drainage, all you're talking about is surface drainage. And we don't normally talk about surface drainage because we have modified green mixes and they drain, but not when they're frozen. So just a little anecdotal backtrack.
Yeah, I think it's funny because turf management has changed a lot in the last 50 years. But there's some basics that we can always rely on, like drainage or certain other aspects, and sometimes we forget about those because we're so worried about, like, hey, what's the next new latest and greatest product, or maybe there's a machine that's come out that's kind of helped us do things differently, and things like DryJect, which weren't around 20 years ago, and other things, tons of technology. So sometimes we tend to forget those basics, and things like surface drainage. They change over time as you're top dressing and as you're doing some of these modifications on your putting green. The surfaces change, and so sometimes it's good to kind of go back and revisit some of the basics. So okay, so we talked about the damage we saw and how it got there. We talked about maybe some of the things that you can do to prevent it: top dressing, drainage, covers, obviously fungicides if we're dealing with the disease aspect of it. Okay, we did everything. It didn't matter. It died. Now what? What have you seen people doing this season in terms of trying to get the recovery back? Now, I will preface this by saying I saw a lot of different things being done, but one of the things that hurt some of the people was it was a pretty cold spring. We didn't really, if you went out too early, you didn't really have much success in getting things to grow. But then the summer's been pretty easy. It's been a really good grass growing season. We've got temperatures in the 50s in July and August in the Philadelphia region. So it's a pretty good grass growing year. So what are your keys to success, or what have you seen that's successful in terms of trying to get the turf back?
Well, partly, John, I think that's dependent on the extent of the damage. Obviously, when you get those areas where it's really nuked, shall we say, and in fairly large amount, then resodding has been the most successful way to go. Now, that being said, resodding is its own problem with regard to what it looks like when it's done, how long does it take through top dressing and good seaming and all that to make it really playable as it ought to be, in contrast to just overseeding. But there's limited option. The one thing that I think is important when you get into that sodding is to cut the sod as thin as you can, and then you don't have to deal with matching the underlying soil physical properties quite as closely as you would if you didn't cut it thin. And making sure that it survives and has some starter nutrition in that root zone before you lay it. I see a lot of times the sod get just plopped down like a Band-Aid, and there's no medicine underneath the Band-Aid, and so you end up with a ugly scab that stays there for longer than you want it to. The other thing that people kind of gave up on, and John touched on the fact that, you know, the spring was really nasty. We from the end of October to the end of April, it was just abnormally cold. And so overseeding was painfully slow. Bentgrass was a primary overseeded species, and you know, a lot of people don't realize how quickly it can germinate under the right conditions and how long it takes under the poor conditions. And so oftentimes after 2, 3, maybe even 4 overseedings with various mechanical approaches prior to dropping the seed, people gave up. They just thought, you know, this is not working. They're not seeing much germination. They're seeing a little germination and then seedling failure. And those that stayed with it and kept pounding the seed were the ones that ended up with the most success. And again, nutrition played an important role in those overseeded areas where once those seedlings came up, and remember how weak a seedling bentgrass is. It needs to be able to find nutrition in a hurry and not be allowed to desiccate out. We didn't have to worry too much about damping off. It was just too cold. So those parameters, nutrition and reestablishment, were the keys for those that succeeded.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what I saw. I saw some people had pounded the bentgrass to it. For us at our research plots at Valentine, we had on our main areas on the lower green, we had about 100% death, and it was all crown hydration because we actually did everything we were supposed to do. We pulled cores out under the snow and under the ice, and we incubated them, and they all came back fine. We were in mid-March. We were like, "Whoa, we made it through. This is great." And then all of a sudden, April rolled around and things didn't look so good, and then it just kept declining and declining. Well, we wanted POA, so our goal was just to aerate the heck out of it and create a seed bed and get the POA to come back, and we didn't put any bent in there. And we're now at 99% coverage, and we're okay, but we also don't have play on there, and it's
Right.
Maintained as a research green. But I was surprised. I saw a lot of bentgrass take pretty well, and I didn't see a lot of POA coming up through those areas. So I don't know if something happened where the POA could have, even the seeds could have died. I don't know how that's possible, but regardless, I saw a lot of success in the bentgrass overseeding, but again, you were right. It's the ones that stuck with it or started late. You know, they made the decision after temperatures already warmed up. They got a really good catch. Um, One of the questions that came up as I've been traveling is, what are people putting out now? There's a lot of new varieties coming out of bentgrass, and I think it depends on what region of the country you go to, which ones they end up having the most recommendations. What have you seen in terms of the newer varieties that are out there, as compared to something, you know, like the early introduction of the new varieties like A1, A4?
Well, it is a mixed bag, as you mentioned, in terms of recommendations that people make. I think we're at a point in time with creeping bentgrass where there's just a whole laundry list of pretty darn good species or varieties out there that are widely adapted geographically. If there is a negative involved, it's that on a lot of these older greens where it's come to an ecological equilibrium between POA and bent, which takes 20, 25 years. If the POA goes away in those circumstances, the bent grasses that are left behind are probably not all that new. And as a result, when you interseed some of the newer ones, which are lower growing by nature and denser by nature and more capable of handling these closer heights of cut, now we've got a bit of a standoff between these different cultivars of creeping bentgrass, which in fact end up being as much problematic as having POA there in the first place.
That's a good point. You know, you think of those courses that established, you know, in the 70s or 80s that maybe have even Pencross, which at the time was, you know, the newer bents. But if you look at that and then put next to it, you know, A1, A4, or Pure Distinction or V8 or some of these new ones, and then all of a sudden, you're right, it's like Pencross versus POA, and now you've got Pencross versus those newer varieties, and so that is going to continue to cause problems. So I was pretty happy with the success that people had this year. I think that it was a hit for a lot of people. You obviously have loss of rounds, you've got loss of revenue, and everybody wants to get out there fast. I think those that ended up kind of punching holes and getting POA back, they've been very, very fortunate that this was an atypical summer, because had we had the heat and the extreme conditions going into July and August, that POA that would have come back probably wasn't going to make it so well through the summer. So I think some people got pretty lucky with that. I don't think anyone felt lucky that they lost turf, but lucky that they were able to maintain it as well as they could this summer.
Yeah, I would agree completely with that comment. The POA is a interesting creature when it's been around for a while, because on these greens, almost all of it has evolved to a perennial type of POA. It's stoloniferous, and many times, and I saw it this spring as well, the POA appeared dead, but the stolons were not. And as time passed, new POA plants popped off the nodes on the stolons of those old perennial ecotypes. Now, it was painfully slow because of the weather in April, but once the weather changed and warmed up, there was quite a bit of POA recovery from vegetation. And then, then it got into a dogfight with the overseeded creeping bentgrass. Who knows what the verdict's going to be there, but my suspicion is that the POA is going to be the dominator, because it wouldn't have been there for 25 years if it couldn't do it. So you got to keep an eye sometimes out for these ecotypes, particularly on putting greens, and how they behave, because sometimes if those stolons are alive, and it doesn't take a microscope to determine whether it's alive or not, and you get in there and mechanically start messing around and overseeding and pounding away at it, then the ability for it to come back from stolons is compromised. And so I guess it boils down to, would you just soon snap your fingers and have back what you had going into winter, or do you want to try to take advantage of this calamity and end up having a shift in what you've got as a cover? And again, that's another decision. And one of the things that a lot of people learn from this experience is that when they communicate well with their Green Committee chair or the Green Committee or the membership at large about the various ways things perish and how challenging it was, I think everybody that I talked to said, you know, the membership has been very patient and very tolerant of what happened. It was one of those instances where members, unless they were in Florida, were very sympathetic. They didn't like the kind of winter we had either. And so that's nice to see that you can spend some time with communication skills and hone them when it's time to put your agronomic prowess to work, why people are watching and appreciating and saying, you know, this is coming back. So that was a plus as well in my mind.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the communication process is huge. It helps when you have several courses in the area that had trouble, but regardless, you have to kind of be able to, you know, educate the membership. They see dead turf and lack of playability in their greens, and that's what they care about, regardless of whether it was your fault or not. And in a winter like this, I honestly don't think there was just about anything that you could do in certain areas to prevent the damage that we saw. So. Well, I think, Tom, we've been about a half hour, a little over, so I think we should probably wrap up. But I think that, you know, we went through what we saw, you know, ways to protect it, and then what people can do to kind of renovate it. So I think we kind of hit on all the topics. And what I'd like you to do next is maybe just touch a little bit on what we're going to do in our next episode, which I believe is going to be in 3 weeks when I get back from a trip.
Yeah, happy to do that, John. If you don't know, John's going to Aussie land for a couple of weeks, and he's not going to play golf every day, but he is going to see
not even bringing my clubs.
There you go. Now, I won't mention Reynolds, but what we're going to do when he gets back is have another episode. And at the outset, I mentioned that we would talk just briefly about who has agreed to join us on the next episode, and that's going to be Matt Schaefer, Director of Golf Operations down at Marion. Many of you know, or I would say all of you probably know who Matt is, and he's excited and enthusiastic about participating in the program as we are and having him join us. So that's the scoop on the first guest.
Good. I'll kind of mention too in the discussion that you and I have had of what we're going to do with this Tom and John show. We hope that we're going to continue to have some guests come on and join us live in the Hangout, but we're also probably moving forward going to try to vary the topics to include sports turf, home lawns, anything turf related, and any current topics and things that are going on in the anywhere around the world as it relates to turf. And we're probably going to start a phone line too, where we can even take some phone guests and phone calls and answer questions. We're going to try and keep this brief and short and timely, and allow it, you know, people to, you know, catch it live or to watch the playback and just get some good tips and bits of information. So I think that's the plan, Tom, right?
Absolutely, John. You nailed it.
All right. Well, why don't you wrap us up, and we'll say bye to everybody.
All right, guys. Look forward to the next time.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
Yep.